All right, welcome everybody. This is installment number 2 in my video on breaking down the different types for Stanley Bailey metallic planes. Started out, talked about types 1 through 4 in the previous video. Maybe you've already watched it. If not, you can feel free to go back and watch that. And then this one's going to cover types 5 through 8. But before we can get started on that, I'm going to lay out a couple ground rules here. First and foremost, all credit for the original type study goes to Roger K. Smith. You can see I've got the Patented Transitional and Metallic Planes in America Volume 2 sitting up there, as well as John Walter's Stanley Tools book, which actually has excerpts from Volume 1 of P. Tampia in it. That's where I drew a lot of this information. You also see Alvin Sellen's The Stanley Plane up there. Of course, got some information from there. And there's some other really great sources out there. Patrick Leach's Blood and Gore can be found on the internet. I'll link to it in the description block for this video. And then that's Hans Brumner's guide over there on the far right. And so got to identify those sources for where this information comes from. Also, I've decided that I'm going to do 2 different versions of this video. I'm going to do one that's going to be hopefully short, sweet, to the point, where I'm just going to highlight the differences in the types from 5, 6, 7, and 8, and really just try to help you identify what type your plane is. And then I'll do a second one that's going to be longer, that's going to get into more detail and show more of the individual nuances and some variations of things that you might see out there. But as far as the original type study goes, maybe you're just getting into planes, maybe you haven't, you're not even aware of these resources that are out there, or you don't want to spend, a couple $100 on books and you're content just looking at the internet. That's all fine. But just know a few things about the type studies. The original type study with Roger K. Smith was based exclusively on the number 4 size planes. And he said that was for consistency and clarity. So that way everything would be relatively consistent. So what you see on a number 4 size plane might be different than what you see on a 5 or 6 or any other size. I'm actually going to highlight some of those things, especially in the longer version of this video. And I also just want to actually borrow a phrase from Roger Smith that he put in the Patented Transitional and Metallic Planes in America Volume 2 in the foreword at the beginning of the book. He was talking about a friend of his named Raymond Townsend, who used to work at Colonial Williamsburg. And his friend said, share your information, don't bore St. Peter with it. And Roger K. Smith goes on to say that he's always tried to follow that proverb, and he hopes that, whoever reads this volume will do the same. So that's really what this is all about. It's about taking the information that's out there on the internet, that's in books, and I'm putting it on the internet once again. No, I'm putting it in a YouTube video so that way y'all can see it up close and personal. And the last thing, maybe 1 or 2 more things that I want to cover about the type studies is you got to be careful with this, because like if you go to, say Hyper Kitten, you go to Blood and Gore, you go to Wooden Shop, you go to the Valley Woodworker, which I've been to all these sites and I've looked at all of them. And if you look at them side by side, there are some variances. And I think that's because of a combination of people have had different experiences. They've seen different things on hand planes. They've maybe read it, different information in another source, or, just good old fashioned typo. But there are differences, and I'm going to do my best to get this right, to help you all out as far as identifying these. And the other thing is, don't get married to the type study. Date it, take it out for dinner, get to know it really well, but don't marry it, because as soon as you marry it, things are potentially going to go downhill, because it's never the same after that. Just kidding. You can think of it like the pirate code. It's more of a set of guidelines, because when the company was producing these planes, the Stanley Rule and Level Company in this case, they were not following any kind of typing guidelines. They weren't saying, oh, well, we're going to finish making all the type 5s today and we're going to start on type 6 and then retool all the machinery. It was not like that back then. So different parts got updated at different times, and I cannot stress that enough. So this is really more of a guideline to help you determine within a reasonable amount of time, this is the year group that my plane was produced, because that's what most everybody wants to know when they're looking at a type study. All right, so let's get right into it, because this is supposed to be the short version. We're trying to identify the type of your plane here. So what you see here before you is from left to right, type 5 through type 8. And so let's look at these telltale signs on the body. Type 5, easy to spot. It's got the smooth frog base. There's no grooves in it yet. And then you got the spacing up here for the number 4, because remember, the type study is based off of the number 4. We'll look at some other variations later. With the type 6, that was where we get the grooves here in the frog bed added. And you can see the spacing is ever so slightly different there. The number and the NO and the 4 are just a little bit further apart. So that's how we know that it's going to be a type 6. And there's not a lot of variation between the 6 and the 7, with one big exception, and that is most of your type 7s are going to have the S casting mark for the Sessions Foundry. And then there's a little bit more space there between the NO and the 4 for the type 7. And then the type 8, you have an even larger gap there. The NO is larger, the 4 is larger, bigger gap there. And then, of course, with the type 8s, you've got the B casting. There's some speculation out there and some theories about what that B was, you know, actually signified, what foundry it was for, maybe Bridgewater. But I have not seen anything definitive in writing on that. If you have, maybe you can weigh in the comments. All right, I'm not going to spend as much time talking about the furniture here. Hopefully you've already watched my video on totes, but I'll just quickly touch on it. Remember the fatter base down here at the bottom on the earlier ones, you know, type 5 through type 8 gets a little skinnier as it progresses through. But again, the fatter base, and you've got more of that forward lean than what we see on the later ones. But, you know, you're talking about wood that is 130-ish years old, give or take. And so if that is not deliberately preserved, if someone did not deliberately set out to preserve that, chances are it's not going to be original. Chances are it's going to be busted, because you're talking about some really old, you know, antique wood. As far as the knobs go, it was the transition between the 5 and the 6 is when that bead went away. And so when you find the beaded knob, that is an indicator that it probably went to a type 5 or older plane. And then once you see the lack of a bead or the absence of the bead, then you know that it's going to be type 6 and later. Of course, those are going to be rosewood, and they're all going to be low knobs. All right, also of note on your knobs and totes, you're going to have the solid brass barrel nut there. All right, next up I'm going to talk about the frogs. I'm going to show you some different ones here, because the biggest change in our transition from the type 4 to the type 5 was the addition of the lateral adjust lever. And in addition to that, of course, the number being cast into the bed was another major change for type 5. So what I've got here is I've actually got a pre-lateral type 4 frog, because as you're reading through the type study or accessing online, you might see where they talk about the arch on the top of the frog. And so there you can see them side by side. But we now have a lateral adjust lever on the type 5. And another thing that you'll hear talked about are the number of patent dates on the lateral adjust. So that's what those patent dates look like typically. And then the biggest telltale sign for a type 5 is going to be that little tab right there. And that's really your best indicator. But as most of us have learned, when you find a plane, especially an older one out in the wild, it is not uncommon for the top of the frog to be sheared off. I get numerous requests for, hey, do you have a new frog for my plane because the top is broken off? So a little hard to use the number of dates on the lateral adjust if you don't have a top of your frog. So let's talk about the back of them. This is, of course, a type 5, and this is a type 6. So here's your best indicator. Typically, there are exceptions to this, but typically you're going to see this rounded back right here on your type 5, and then it's going to be squared up here and then have the hole for your type 6. So that's your number one indicator. And again, in the long version of this video, I'm going to go into more nuance and talk about more intricate details, but for the purpose of this, we're just trying to help you determine the age of your plane. And as you can see, major change from the type 5 to the type 6 is going to be going from that little tab that would engage the slot on the iron over to the disc or the wheel here that actually engages your iron. And so that's a big change from type 5 to type 6. So with the type 6, we have the addition of another patent date to the lateral adjust if you're fortunate enough to have one. So we now have 3 patent dates, and you will sometimes see these imprinted upside down like this. Sometimes you'll see them right side up. This is one of the fun things about cleaning a plane up is, you know, that if you hit that with a light abrasive, don't overdo it and ruin your patina. But if you hit that with a light abrasive, you can see how many patent dates show up there, as far as if it's 3. Later on, we'll talk about when it might be 1. But again, oh, and also patent information on the inside of the brass blade adjustment knob there. And so that's another indicator that you're looking at a type 6 and older. So let me go ahead and highlight the differences between your type 6 and your type 7 frogs. I'm using 2 3/8 inch frogs that would fit a number 6 or a number 7. But for the most part, this does generalize to the number 4 size as well. So your biggest telltale difference is going to be, do you have that patent information on the inside of the brass blade adjustment knob, or is it gone? That is your biggest difference between the 6 and the 7 as far as the frogs go. And another thing is going to be a lot of your type 7s are going to have the S casting. In this case, this one does not, but most of them will have an S, and it's usually going to be right there. Also, the midway through the type 7s, per Roger Smith's original type study, midway through the type 7s is when Stanley transitioned from the right-handed thread to the left-handed thread. And so as you can see, this one has been reversed. But not all of your type 7s will have that. So as a matter of fact, here is a frog with the S casting there, just so that you can see what it looks like. And last but not least, now we're ready to transition from your type 7 to your type 8. This is typically super, super easy because, as you can see, you've got your casting marks. So your S casting for the Sessions Foundry, and then we go to the B casting on your type 8s. And so usually pretty easy as long as it does in fact have that casting there. And then another thing that you see on the type 8s is now we're down to 1 patent date on the lateral adjust lever. Once again, if you're fortunate enough to have a lateral adjust lever. But as you can see, typing gets a little bit easier through type 8 there. And between your body and your frog, which we've now talked about, hopefully you're able to identify the main components on your plane. All right, we don't want the lever caps feeling left out, so we'll go ahead and talk about those too. So type 5, type 6 is just going to have the plain lever cap on the front. It's going to be plain on the back. Pretty straightforward. When we get to the 7, most of the 7s are going to go ahead and have that S casting for the Sessions Foundry. And then when we get to the 8, then we're going to see the B casting. But don't stress, don't fret if you have everything else on your plane is marked with a B casting, but your lever cap is not, because remember, not everything got the casting mark. So as far as the actual dates go, just in case you haven't looked this up on the internet before, your type 5s are going to be produced between 1885 and 1888. Your type 6s from 1888 to 1890. And then your type 7s from 1893 to 1899. And then your type 8s from 1899 to 1902. And if you're wondering about that gap in there, it's because there was a type 6A that I will go into more detail on in the longer version of this video. So last and certainly not least, we got to talk about the irons. So this is typical of what your irons would have looked like, as far as the type 5s still having the hole up at the top versus down at the bottom like we see on the later ones. Unfortunately, I don't have a good stamp, logo, trademark, whatever you want to call it, to show you. So I will have to refer you to a couple of websites that I'm going to link to in the video description there. But just know that that's what it's typically going to look like. And then it was during the type 6 period that Stanley actually made the change and moved the hole down to the bottom. And then that's also when we get this particular trademark. And per the type study, this is considered the Q trademark or Q logo. So if that helped you identify the type for your plane and the corresponding age, then fantastic. My work here is done. If you're now hungering or thirsting for more information and you want to know more, then please do tune in to the longer version of the video, which will be forthcoming in the next few days. And I do appreciate you viewing it. I appreciate even more if you subscribe. Appreciate even more still if you tell a friend and if you share this video, because, you know, it's all about sharing knowledge, just like Roger Smith called. We don't want to bore St. Peter when we get to the pearly gates. We want to get all this information out there now. If you have any questions, comments, you know, if you want to know more, if you want to weigh in based on maybe you've seen something different, by all means, please do that in the comments or visit my Facebook page, Just Plain Fun, the parts division. But most of all, thank you, and look forward to talking with y'all.